Welcome to Rock Talks, a podcast about music documentaries. I'm David Lizerbram, and today we are going to be joined by Tyler Jordan of the Texas band Good Looks. We love Good Looks. They're awesome, and we were super excited to have Tyler on. You heard his music and Good Looks music at the top, and you'll hear some more at the end of the podcast. Please check them out. They're called Good Looks. They've got an album coming out later this year if you're listening to this kind of as it comes out, but their previous album from 2022 is fantastic, and go see them live. Support great musicians who are doing real interesting, cool, fun stuff. And the podcast today is about the movie Without Getting Killed or Caught, which is about the Texas musician Guy Clark, as well as his wife Susanna Clark and Townes Van Zandt, and their kind of relationship, friendship, etc. It's from 2020, and it's directed by Tamara, Saviano, and Paul Whitfield. Now, I hate when people start a podcast with an apology, but I have to do that in this particular case because we had an audio issue, which was entirely my fault. We recorded this interview or conversation with myself, Tyler, and my co-host, Andy Keatts, who is very much here in spirit. However, the audio from Andy's side did not get recorded. It never he spoke, but there was no recording of it. And that is, again, entirely my fault. So there was a lot of editing, obviously, that had to be done to this podcast. So you'll hear the edited conversation. You'll hear me. You'll hear Tyler. You won't hear Andy, unfortunately. He had great things to say, but that's how it goes. I think everything came out okay still. We were able to preserve most of Tyler's great thoughts and comments and insights and humor and all the other wonderful things that make him a great guy and lead him to become a fantastic songwriter. And, an interesting conversation about the movie. But again, if anything sounds a little wonky or there's a weird cut or something like that, don't blame Tyler, don't blame Andy, don't blame Guy Clark, don't blame Townes Van Zandt. Blame me. But that said, apologies aside, I hope you enjoy this episode of Rock Docs with me, not Andy, and Tyler Jordan of the band Good Looks. Support them, give them some love, and here you go. Enjoy. Let's roll out the red carpet for our very special guest, Tyler Jordan of the band Good Looks. Say hi, Tyler.
Hey there, guys. How's it going?
We're big. We're Good Looks stans. I don't know if you guys have stans, but we're we're starting it.
But sure.
Why not? Why not? Yeah.
Not many. Like
they're coming. Watch out.
Okay, good.
I mean, you can tell us about Good Looks, but I mean, as far as came across our radar this year, a band out of Texas. I think Andy and I, if I'm not wrong, Andy, correct me, but I think we both heard about the band through Steve Hyden, the music writer, and
okay.
friend of the show, former guest here, and he was like, "Yeah, there's this band out of Texas, kind of like a country rock Americana vibe, and real interesting lyrics, and their first album's out." And I was like, "That sounds up my alley," and immediately Andy's and my text thread just started blowing up. Like, have you heard this? This is awesome. This is great. We love it. And yeah, Andy's seen you twice live, and I haven't had the chance yet, but hopefully you guys will make it out to the West Coast again soon. Anyway, I don't know. Like, tell me about Good Looks. What's the deal with your band?
We're a somewhat political, very emotionally vulnerable rock and roll band. So not too dissimilar from the War on Drugs or Kurt Weill or something in that vein.
Yeah, that makes
sense.
Maybe
a little bit more folk in there.
Those are good comps. We both like the War on Drugs and Kurt Weill, so that's kind of good comps. I think kind of the thumbnail about, if I've heard stuff about you guys in terms of the lyrical approach, is that it's like, well, kind of coming from a, for lack of a better term, a left political perspective, but with an empathy for kind of living in Trump country. And I think that's true in parts, but I think probably that, I mean, I don't know if you just kind of latch onto that, or if you, from my perspective, that's just like a facet just from the songs I've heard. But there's a lot more going on. I mean, do you think that's kind of like a reductive angle on it, or is that kind of you think a fair description?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's true. I mean, I'm a socialist, and this definitely comes through in some of the songs, and I think maybe that probably comes more from the title track "Bummer Year," where I'm kind of describing some friends, former friends of mine, and it's interesting. Like I've it's been there's been like different takes to that song, but I kind of was coming to it from less of a place of like let's all get along to more of a place of like meeting folks where they're at, and like as a socialist I believe in organizing, masses of people, and in order to do that you got to win over folks, and so that's kind of the place where I'm coming from, more than a, I don't know, reconciling of these two sides of America. I just think, sometimes liberals kind of miss the opportunity. There's a lot of like talking down to people on the left that happens. The key elements of the band are my songwriting and then his guitar playing. I think he kind of, otherwise these songs would probably be just a lot more straightforward folk songs, but then he kind of comes in and brings weird guitar tones over things, and brings his whole set of influences over the top of it. And man, yeah, he's just a gnarly guitar player. Good Looks is my songs. I write them, and bring the chord progressions, and then we arrange together. But we also do that in his band called the Stacks, and so those are his songs, and he brings them, and we arrange those together. So yeah, we play in a couple of projects together. He's my best friend, and we've been playing together and I guess for about 5 years now, and we've known each other for about 7.
I wanted to ask
Mm-hmm.
about Jake, how he's doing. I know he he kind of had a rough break there right about when the
Yeah,
album came out. I don't know if it's something you want to talk about
that's
or.
right. No, I'm happy to talk about it. Um, yeah, he's doing great. It was definitely really scary. It was a very a very serious head injury that he sustained, and he got hit by a car and knocked to the ground, where he like hit his head on the ground pretty hard, and he fractured his skull and had a pretty serious brain contusion. But he made it was a really rapid recovery. Like, we canceled everything and for like 4 months out, and when it happened the first couple of weeks, I wasn't even sure that I was going to be playing, in bands with this guy anymore. We just didn't know where he was going to be. Um, and then 2 months later he was pretty much ready to go, which was wild. He's kind of like the luckiest unlucky dude, is the way that I would describe Jake. But he there's definitely still some hangups. I mean, I think there's some like PTSD with cars and car noises, and I definitely think the emotions are like more forefront and stuff. Like, it's definitely still a big part. I don't think it's particularly noticeable unless you know him well, which I do. So, but it's definitely something he's still working through, and but for the most part, we're just really grateful that he got to where he's at. We played the record release show in our hometown, and we were literally leaving for tour the next day for like a 3 week or 2.5 week tour. And yeah, he was the last one to leave the club, which is always kind of his vibe, and I was the first one to leave, which is always my vibe. And yeah, he was getting a ride home from a friend. We kind of talk about it. It's funny because Jake is an eternal optimist and I'm a pessimist, and he always gets princess parking like right at the front, because he's willing to like drive by the front to see, and this was just an instance where his truck wasn't working, and so he was getting a ride home from a friend and had to walk way the hell away from the venue to get back into the vehicle. And yeah, it was a pretty wild timing thing. It was the first sold out show we'd ever played, and just like this really kind of triumphant, hometown show, and just to go from this really high moment to one of the scariest moments of my life was, that was a pretty big mind fuck. This is a weird thing to say, but I do think there was maybe some silver lining in the fact that like him getting hit by a car was a compelling story, like that's obviously
Yeah,
not
we're
worth it
talking about
and
it now.
not what we wanted to happen, but it definitely like found its way into the PR stuff, and it felt like maybe it got mentioned more. It was also really helpful that like it happened right at the time of the PR campaign because then the GoFundMe link was there, and that was really helpful in his recovery and allowed him to like not work and just focus on getting better. So there were a lot of positives attached to it, and I don't know what would have happened, but we feel pretty happy with the way that the fall went and the shows went, and so really just super grateful and nothing to nothing to really complain about.
So, keeping it positive and looking forward, you guys have a new album coming out. That's all track now?
It's completely done except for the mixing. So we finished it up, I think couple of weeks ago, and yeah, it's almost there. We're kind of just, and we're not we're we're even in like the second round of mixing, so we're really close. It's sounding super good. I'm very excited.
Any idea when we're gonna be able to hear some new good looks?
I we're trying really hard to get a single out before South by in March. So
Okay.
that's kind of the plan. And then hopefully uh record later in the year, maybe in the summer or something. I'm not 100% sure on the date yet.
Let's talk about the rock doc of the day. So yeah, we typically allow or invite our guests to pick a documentary, and this is well, you gave us a couple options, notoriously, and this is the one that we landed on. Let's say,
Hmm.
um, and yeah. So without getting killed or caught, it's about Guy Clark. So Tyler, I'll kind of throw it to you to start. So like, um, first of all, what's your relationship with Guy Clark's music before before this documentary came out?
Yeah, it's interesting. Almost no relationship. I'm a huge Towns fan, and I'm a huge Steve Earle fan, who are both kind of featured in this documentary. Towns more heavily, but I really didn't have a huge background in Guy Clark, so this was kind of more of an introduction to his work for me. Heard his name forever, heard a few songs here and there, but just never spent time with an album. Um, and yeah, I saw it first in theaters, and there was like a little local film, our Austin Film Society, uh, put it put it on here, and then this was my second time. I rewatched it for this, and it was it was cool to see it again. I had some different opinions or something the second time around. I don't know.
So to kind of tee up the movie, and I mean, I guess usually when we talk about rock docs, it's like kind of a joke that we even like discuss like whether there's gonna be spoilers. Because like okay, we all know what happened to Elvis or something, but like um
Hmm.
in this case, I mean, um, this is. I mean, we'll talk about the whole movie. But in this case, I definitely think, if you're thinking about watching it, this might be a good situation where, press pause, check out the movie. You can get it on the website, like without getting killed or caught. Right now, that's pretty much the place to get it. Maybe it'll like eventually make it onto the Netflixes of the world or whatever. But all right, so we'll just kind of get into that. So basically, the movie is about these three people, these three characters. Guy Clark, who's a kind of rangy West Texas intellectual songwriter, and his best friend, Towns Van Zandt, fellow Texas singer songwriter legend, and sort of troubled soul, and probably the more famous of the two, certainly at this point. I would
Hmm.
say,
I would agree with that.
and then Guy's wife, Susanna, who also I'm not really sure how to describe it. I mean, there was a period of time when she had a relationship with Towns. There was time when they all lived together, and Towns was kind of the roommate. But
Hmm.
it's almost the kind of situation where, like, I feel like if this was like 2023, it would have been like, you guys should be in a poly relationship and
Uh
be very
huh.
online
Yeah.
about it. You know what I mean? But like in the 70s, I don't know in Texas, I don't know that would have been, like I don't know. Who knows what was really going on behind closed doors? But anyway, so it's really about this sort of love triangle, honestly.
That's right.
She did live with Towns for some period of time. Now, all she says about that is like they
And
stayed up
even
and watched Nick at Night. But, presumably there was
yeah.
a little bit more going on than that.
And even
And
even when they're like she's like, "He brought me breakfast in bed," they show him, like, kinda coming in, it's, like, almost like she's in bed,
right.
he's not been there. I don't know, yeah, they really try to avoid it, to
Right. Well,
it
I
seems like.
mean, to kind of break the seal, I mean, none of these people are still with us. So,
That's
by
right.
the time the movie is made, Towns dies in the not late 90s, if I'm not wrong, something like that. Uh
97.
yeah, he, more or less drank himself to death.
Hmm.
And Susanna, sort of got hooked on pain pills and eventually died in the early 2010s. A guy dies a few years later. So by the time the film is made, none of them are here to, to clarify any of these points. The movie is really kind of narrated um through these the she apparently Susanna was very into like having a tape recorder and just recording their conversations, like these sort of drunken
Hmm.
conversations they would have, which is great. And then there's a lot of narration from her, from things that she either wrote down or recorded, that actually I didn't even realize until the end of the movie. I'm like, what is that voice? It was Sissy Spacek who was reading her voice. But
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, and it was like kind of bugging me the whole time because at first I didn't know that she was no longer alive, and so I was like, it doesn't sound like her when you hear her recording. And anyway, um, but she's really the narrator, and Guy is sort of this. Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's nominally a movie about Guy Clark. He's sort of the main character, but in a way, she's given, if not equal weight, a lot of similar treatment, and as his Towns,
Hmm.
and it's just such an interesting dynamic as opposed to just a
Hmm.
movie that is like Guy Clark and it's about him, like most of the documentaries we watch are about one person, and all the other spouses and friends and collaborators in their life are clearly the side characters. So that made
Hmm.
this just kind of a different kind of vibe than some of the other ones we watched, and I think it really worked.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think the definitely the audio tapes of the conversations. I mean, that is just like gold. That's one of the things, the most compelling things about this documentary to me is like some of the conversations they're having. It's the one that really stands out. Kind of happens in the middle of the movie is the one where Towns is really drunk and he's kind of hassling. Guy Clark has had some success. He's had a couple albums out on major labels. Towns is at a point where he's kind of struggling. He's past his like major label albums, and he's just kind of breaking, uh, guys balls about like, tell me how you do it. Give me some advice about how to, and then Guy Clark's like. He's like, well, you were so drunk the other night and you wouldn't give those two important guys like the time of day, and they wanted to like help you put a record out or whatever. And he's like, well, he says I seem to get drunk every so often.
There you go.
Which is just like the most perfect like comedic timed line. It was so good.
And there's these like animated illustrations of some of the stories that are kind of in her art style because she was also an artist,
Mm.
a painter, which are so charming and really great. And it's like great. We watch documentaries of all different scope, let's say, in terms of like budget, and sometimes it's like, some big, artists that, they give Martin Scorsese all the money in the world. Sometimes they're, it's like you can tell they're just scraping by and they want to tell this story, which can be really great. And this kind of is in the middle where like it doesn't seem like they didn't have Peter Jackson get back money, but they were able to pull the resources together. And I'm sure making a documentary in any context is not easy, but they were able to pull the
Mhm.
resources together to have this great animation, and it's so cool. Probably the thing of the movie that worked the least well for me is the very beginning, because at the very beginning of the movie, it like says, okay, it's 1971, and they're talking about this, I guess, road trip they went on, and like there's they must have rented like a 1971 Volkswagen van, and it's kind of filming, like these people going on this road trip, and it's in this like contemporary digital photography, so it's like supposed to be 1971 but it doesn't look like it. And I'm
Mm.
like, this is like a weird, this kind of recreation thing is real tough to pull off, and it is a really weird opening. And then so I was like, oh boy, if we're gonna get a lot of this movie's gonna be rough, and they never go back to that. So I don't know why that's in there.
Mm.
I'm not quite sure why that choice is there. I'm glad they moved away from it, but the rest of it, sort of aesthetically as a piece, really works.
Mm. I mean, I totally missed that. I'm so visually oblivious. Like that just that just went right over my head. I missed the fact that that was digital and not a real home movie.
These guys bounced around a lot. They moved around. I mean, guy was like a struggling songwriter, and he was 30 when they moved out to Long Beach in LA, and trying to kind of make it. And then Townes Van Zandt came out to LA to record an album, and eventually Guy Clark gets a publishing deal, moves back to Nashville. So he's now in his 30s. I mean, like, we're skipping over a lot. But this was not like some success story where some 22-year-old comes out of the gate and immediately,
Hmm.
Nashville's lining up. I mean, these guys were scraping to
Hmm.
survive for years, if not decades. So talking about how Guy gets married to Susanna, but she says all along basically like that she and Towns were really soulmates, and at one point the three of them were
Hmm.
living together, and they had 2 cents to their name. And like I said, she's a painter. At one point Towns went out and bought her paint rather than food, and she says
Hmm.
that as a way of showing how much he understood her, not like
Hmm.
it's slamming this guy like I was starving and he bought paint, but like as to say like, wow, this guy really knew who I was and what I needed for my soul. And
Hmm.
that was just kind of like one little glimpse, but an illustration of like the margins these people were living on, long before they all
Yeah,
had some level of success.
it's kind of interesting uh, too. I This time through, and this is like a weird thing to say, but this time through, I it sort of made me it sort of made me dislike certain parts of Guy Clark, just personality wise or something like. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into this the pieces, but kind of what you get is that maybe he is slightly more self-involved or slightly more, kind of paying attention and not as like responsive to her needs. And like the great tragedy of the film is that she, in some ways she married the wrong person. It seems like, I don't know, that she had this great soulmate in Towns, and when Towns died, her life kind of ended. um so like that part is really, it just eats at you. It's one of those, it just feels like a lot of life regret throughout the whole movie. That's one of the most unsatisfying things about this movie, is the way that they describe her mental illness, or whatever it is, addiction. They just spend so little time on it, and it's so briefly discussed, that like that part just feels very, I feel very unsatisfied by the way that was talked about in this movie.
Yeah, I feel like there's a couple gaps like that. Um, and what I think is otherwise a strong movie.
Hmm.
I definitely agree with that piece. Another part that I wanted to know more about is like before Susanna, when Guy was very young, he kind of had like a shotgun wedding with this woman. They had a baby, and he basically like kind of bails on her. um,
That's right.
so their son Travis is born. Travis Clark. You really, I mean, they just basically dispense with her, this woman, Susan,
Hmm.
who is his first wife. We don't really know what happens with her. And you don't hear anything about Travis. And he goes on and meets Towns Van Zandt and Susanna, and he has his whole life and blah, blah, blah. Um, and then years later, so, I mean, Guy has this struggle. He releases all these albums, but they don't sell. Some of his songs get covered, and that does okay. But he's struggling really for years and years and years. He has his career renaissance in the '90s when the Americana phase kind of came around, and Johnny Cash became popular again, and he kind of got swept up in that, which is great for him and his career. And then at one point they mentioned like, oh yeah, kind of remember his son. Well, his son, they reunited, and he became Travis became his bass player in the '90s. And it's like, and you see them kind of playing together on stage, and there's a great vibe. um but it's never mentioned again. Travis doesn't appear in the movie. He doesn't speak, and nobody knows what happened. The first wife could be kicking around. She could be in the theater. You don't know. It's like,
Uh-huh.
I'm just like, guys, give me a little bit more. Like, give me one sentence to kind of wrap this up.
Did you not get the vibe? I don't know. I think it might just be a failure of the movie, but it's like, oh yeah, this guy's useful to me. He can play bass in my band now. Like, I'm gonna
Yeah,
bring this guy back in. Like,
right. It almost was like, well, I need a bass player, and technically he's my son. No, I don't. I mean, it's like, because, well, the point is the movie doesn't clear this up, so you could just read any of
uh-huh.
these things in, right?
That's
I
right.
mean, it's and so I just feel like there's a couple of things that were left unsaid, and I know they. I guess part of it is like they really wanted to rely on Suzanne's diaries and that narrative was so strong that whatever's not mentioned in there kind of gets, you know what I mean? It's like kind of doesn't make the
That's
movie.
right.
And I think that's probably why some of these things aren't really explained. But I do, there are other talking heads in the movie. It's not only Suzanne's words. I mean, we get a
Hmm.
lot of Rodney Crowell speaking, some Steve Earle, some, kind of vintage audio and video of Guy Clark himself speaking and Towns. Yeah, but none of them really get into those kind of points, which is, a little bit of a miss. But I don't know. I mean, for me, what's there is really good. It's
Hmm.
just what's left out that's kind of leaves a few questions.
Sure, absolutely. I agree with that.
After this, I went back. After we watched this, I went back and rewatched Heartworn Highways, which is a
Mm.
classic doc that was filmed in the '70s, and it features Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark and a lot of other people that are contemporary to that time. It's really great as well. Highly recommend it. And just incredible music, much more musically oriented than this one. I mean, it's just like mostly performances,
Mhm.
but a lot of the highlights of that movie, if you ever seen it or remember, is David Allan Coe driving his RV and just like classic '70s trucker vibes, like like just on that on that radio and just talking about the the traffic ahead with the other guys on the road who all know it's David Allan Coe. They're super stoked to be talking, and it's classic. So that ties in right there. I was kind of wondering though when I'm watching the documentary, it's like, well, did he have relationships with these? I mean, he's kind of lumped in with these guys like Waylon and Willie and the boys, so to speak,
Mhm.
and they're not really mentioned, and so I guess they just weren't really relevant to his life. But you are kind of curious, like, well, what's I mean, whenever Andy and I talk about these documentaries all the time, we're always curious about musicians and like what their relationships are with other people at that time, that they must have run
Mhm.
into. But, I guess if it's like just okay, yeah, I ran into Willie Nelson from time to time and he was a guy around. I don't, I
Mhm.
made there may not be really a story there.
It it's interesting. It's like I'm kind of curious if it's just because Willie was so successful in the country world. Like they forged their own path, Willie and Waylon and but then had lots of success in the country world. And Guy Clark and Towns forged their own path and had no success, like for a long time, and didn't really so I wonder if it's just that they were like kind of on different like career trajectories and levels almost at they probably knew each other. And also the other cool thing is that I didn't know, I had forgotten too, was that Susanna painted the Stardust album cover, which was really cool.
Yeah. Yeah,
That
yeah,
was like
yeah, that's right.
super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, she had her own success. She was a successful songwriter. She did all kinds of stuff. And she
Yeah.
seemed to just knock it off like, "Oh, you need a song like this? Like, I'll be your San Antonio Rose. Well, here you go." And she wrote it and it ended up being a big song, she just didn't really seem to care. Like Guy I think said like she never even learned to tune a guitar. Like she would just pick one up
Uh-huh.
and write a song and then that would become a hit. And meanwhile, they're like scraping by for years and years. She just had
Uh-huh.
that kind of ability.
They kind of dance around it, and I can't remember if they use Guy's words or not, like in the middle part, but they kind of talk about Towns and Guy like being unwilling to pander to mainstream country audiences like a little bit. And then there's even this part where he kind of oscillates like back and forth where he says, I would, if I could, I would go out there and I would write a hit for Garth Brooks, and like I'd love to write a number one song. And then he has this quote that I like wrote down because it just irked me, which is like, I'm just cursed with artistic integrity, which is the exact opposite of what he just said, which is like I would do it if I could, I'm just like, what does that mean? uh,
That is really good. So, yeah, some of the other stuff I really liked in the movie was when Guy was talking about his childhood and how he grew up. There's some great sequences. I mean, he
hmm
he he talks about West Texas like this mythical land.
hmm
He says like I've seen oil wells blow out like gushers. I've seen tumbleweeds and sandstorms. He's just kind of like this like rambling storyteller type guy. A lot of his songs are really story songs, pretty simple and sometimes he does that kind of talking over the song thing that probably has a technical term that I don't know.
hmm
But he talks about this guy, this wildcatter that he grew up with who was sort of like a father figure to him,
hmm
Jack Briggs. He talks about his mom's mom, who was like a, came out in a covered wagon and was a federal judge and like a hanging judge, like, and just all these like characters that you would hear, see in an old Western. And he kind of,
Mhm.
grew up kind of like right on the edge of that world. And then he would, he worked in a shipyard, and like really all he wanted to be was a carpenter, for years. And
Mhm.
he ended up becoming a luthier. Like he made guitars and fixed guitars, and he loved to work with his hands, and he has that kind of craftsmanship, which is kind of ironic because later when he had that greatest hits album that came out and they called it Craftsman, he was like mad about that title because for some
Mhm.
reason it rubbed him the wrong way.
Uh-huh.
But
'Cause he's an
uh,
artist. He's an
right.
artist. It's not a craft.
Listen, you,
I
you
don't
have
know,
arts and
man.
crafts. They're not the same thing, clearly. Otherwise, it would just be one thing.
It's like one of his great life regrets is letting them call it that, you know? This podcast is not good for me because I feel like me talking so much shit on Guy Clark is really fucking with my life goal of meeting and opening for Steve Earle, which so like this is gonna come back to haunt me. I know it.
It's well, Steve Earle definitely listens to this show, so you're really
Yeah,
screwed
for
now.
sure. Yeah.
But no, I mean, let me just say this: there's a lot of Guy Clark music in this documentary, and the dude never wrote a bad song, as far as I could tell.
Mhm.
He was cursed with artistic integrity. He was a artist, not a craftsman, whatever you want to call it. But man, like he is good, and like I kind of had a light understanding of his stuff. I mean, I'd kind of like, checked out, Desperado's Waiting for a Train and some of, I mean, LA Freeway, some of those type of tunes I had heard, just kind of scrolling through the, outlaw country playlists and things like that. But, um, uh, every single time he's singing, or performing, in this movie, from when he's a young man to, at the end of his life, he crushes. Like it just,
Mhm.
the guy absolutely had the goods. And so for all of his ups and downs as a person, his prickly personality, like he certainly left us with a lot of great songs.
For sure. I love that. That last song is probably my favorite of all the songs that I've heard of his. The My Favorite Picture of You. It's such a great idea for a song. It's like it's so smart. Like and it's like there's no some of the stuff I feel I don't know what it is about that song, but it's just so honest and so direct. Like I just love it. Oh, I also wrote down this because I thought it was, and it was towards the end of the movie, so I figured it was maybe a good time to say it. But um, I love the story about when he's like decided he's not going to play any more shows. This is maybe like another of the villain moments where he like his friend, I think it's Verlin Thompson, is like describing what happens, and he calls the booking guy and he says, don't book me nothing else, and he just like hangs up, and I'm like, this is the last work you're ever going to do with this guy. You want to say thank you so much for all of the work that you've done for me. He's just like click.
Oh
This
my
is
gosh.
really wild. I just don't move through the world that way, so it's really hard to just some of the interactions I just can't I can't wrap my brain around.
um yeah, this movie's full of great bits. One of my favorites, which I hope you guys caught, was at one point there's a picture of Susanna. It must be in the maybe 80s, and she's standing outside with Towns, and she's wearing a poncho, and the embroidered on
Mm,
the poncho are the words "and lefty," which
yeah.
is just like such a great bit because, like,
Uh-huh.
of course, that's Towns' most famous song. We don't hear it in the they don't mention that song in this documentary. We don't hear it. We don't hear Towns' music. It's only Guy Clark's music. But it's like that little
Right.
moment is just so funny, and it's just such a little, a little Easter egg for the people that are also, big
Mhm.
Towns fans. There's, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in there. Yeah, there's also that story in here uh about how he uh how okay, so Guy Clark, I guess if I'm getting the story right, you actually used to go hang out in Lukenbach, Texas, and he like was
Mhm.
telling Chips Morman, I think his name is, I'm trying to remember his name, the songwriter, um about it. He's like, oh yeah, I go down to Lukenbach, Texas.
Our guitar player Jake, he's got some stories of like going to, I wish he was here to tell him to he's got some stories of going to Lukenbach to hanging out. And his dad was like this kind of like Texas country radio DJ. And so
Oh, wow.
Jake's got some really good stories. Like he's met Willie Nelson before. His dad was really good friends with Kinky Friedman. They would go to uh, Lukenbach and hang out. He's got this one story he tells a lot about him being at Lukenbach and this guy asking him if he wanted any LSD, and he's like, I don't know. He's like, Lone Star Draft,
No.
which is a type of beer in Texas, but
Love it. Love it.
but it definitely still exists. It still kind of has that like mythical thing. I'm thinking about, I go out to this folk fest every year called the Kerrville Folk Festival that happens outside of Austin in the Texas Hill Country. And I think I would be bummed if I told someone how because I'm constantly like, this is such a great folk fest. This is so awesome. And if someone wrote a song about the folk fest without going and got famous off of it and made, millions of dollars, because I told them, I think I would feel a little upset.
Yeah. So for the future Good Looks documentary, we'll look out for that saga.
All I'm saying is that you guys better not write any fucking songs about
Damn.
Kerrville.
What was that? How do you spell that?
Yeah, I mean, Jake and I go every year. That's actually where we met for the first time. And Jake grew up in the town of Kerrville, and so he used to like kind of sneak into the festival. And yeah, it's just a really great time. It's an 18-day long festival, which is really wild. And it was also just, coincidentally, it was Jake's first gig back after the accident. We played the 50th anniversary of the Folk Fest on the main stage, and that was just really, really special. And yeah, I've been going out there. I've done the whole, basically, except for the pandemic, obviously, when it was canceled, I've done the whole 18 days every year since 2009, which
Wow.
is pretty crazy. Before we were playing, we were always volunteering. And kind of the structure is every day there's a show in the evening, but during the day we go swimming. There's a lot of really pretty rivers. And actually, First Crossing, the song off of Bummer Year, is about the Kerrville Folk Festival. It's kind of like a snapshot of different pieces of the Folk Fest. And yeah, it's just a really special place, a really good time. It happens in May, around Memorial Day. This band Saturn, I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. It's like sad, like the word Saturn.
Okay.
And they're
Like the
coming and
Beatles.
playing.
It's a
Yeah. It's very, it kind of is.
play on words.
They're coming and playing a set out there, so we're really excited about that. Two things that I wanted to say. One, that they play the Chili Parlor song a couple of times, where he's like drinking Mad Dog margaritas.
Yeah, that's Dublin Blues.
Okay, cool. I said, not a huge. I haven't spent a lot of time, but Chili Parlor still exists in Austin, which is really cool, and it looks like
I thought that was like a
hasn't,
made up thing.
No, it's what's interesting is the Mad Dog margaritas were made up. Like that wasn't real, and now they made them because of that song. But that was made up. But the Chili Parlor is still there, and it's really cool. It looks like it hasn't been updated since the 70s, and it's just really badass. As a side note. And only other thing was like that line of this goes back, we've already covered this and I'm sorry, but
No.
the line about Susanna says the line about the wedding, which just like crushes me. Like she's talking about Towns, and it's right after he dies or is about to die or something. She's very like upset, and she says he was the best man in our wedding, and he was the best man at our wedding. And I'm like, oh, that's just such a wild thing to say.
Yeah, all three of these people had a way with words. They could just like coin. They just had that ability. All three of them. Just the circumstances they came out of. Yeah, I mean, Absolutely. It's a time and place, especially for for Guy and I guess Towns, where like being a songwriter is just like this noble ideal, and it's I guess in just this world that they created, where there's this great footage of them, in the '70s, all hanging out like in their living room, smoking and drinking and trading songs with, Rodney Crowell and Steve Earle, and all these, Emmylou Harris is involved, and all these people.
Mhm.
Where, yeah, I mean, I guess just in this context, being a songwriter with a certain type of craftsmanship, for lack of a better term, was seems like it was the highest thing you could attain in life. You know what I mean? Like it just
Mhm.
they just all convinced themselves that this was what it was. And the result is this
Mhm.
just like I think Rodney Crowell says about I think he's the one who says about Guy Clark that he had a jeweler's eye. Like, he
Mhm.
had that precision in terms of finding just the right detail and the right couple of words to create the image that, told the story of the song and created the emotion. And, and he says it as though that is just the highest possible compliment. And, and it's really just kind of a beautiful, like, vibe. Tyler, as we kind of get close to wrapping it up, usually at the end, we ask our guests, like, if you're talking to somebody that's not necessarily a huge fan of Guy Clark or whatever, you're just like, hey, tell me a movie to watch. Like, is this a movie you think I, should just throw on? Would you recommend it, or do you think that somebody really has to be steeped in this kind of thing, or have an affinity for it to appreciate it?
That's hard to say. I can't totally take myself out of my songwriter brain. I definitely think any songwriter would enjoy this movie. I think probably most music fans would enjoy this movie. Um, but outside of those two things, I don't know. I'm not sure if you're not like into music on some level. Well, why the hell are you listening to this podcast? But you know,
True. Like an
but
hour in, enough already. Jeez.
oh
Come on,
man.
people. Yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, like, if you're just a person that country music hits you the wrong way, which definitely is not any of us on
Mhm.
this call, but I mean, there's some people just can't hang with country music, just like any other, whatever, any other genre. That's fine.
Mhm.
Then you're probably not going to vibe with this one. It's not a there's a lot of great bits, and the kind of love triangle aspect of it, which is kind of alluded to, is compelling, but it's a little bit under the surface. They're not hitting you over the head with stuff. But if you're open to the kind of vibe and you're interested in that
Mhm.
kind of the music, or the kind of Texas in the '70s, that kind of the scene that they set, then like I think it really pays off, and it's got a lot of great detail.
Mhm. Yeah, you certainly don't have to be a Guy Clark fan to enjoy this movie, too. So,
Agreed. All right. Well, I think that is the movie. So once again, we will recommend this movie, and even more strongly recommend the band Good Looks, which people should support in any way you can support music nowadays. See them live when they come to your town. Buy their uh, records and tapes, and stream if that's what you got to do. Do what you got to do, but support them and show them some love. And Tyler, this was a real treat. I mean, we've been looking forward to this for a long time, and boy, just a real pleasure to talk to you. And thanks for the awesome music you guys are putting out.
man, no, thank you so much for having me. You guys are delightful, and this was super pleasant.
Cool. All right. Well, that was Rock Docs.
All my friends from high school, they all bought motorcycles, joined up with a bike gang, supported Donald Trump. I don't think they're evil, even when they're awful. Not totally class conscious, but ultimately good. 'Cause they're the kind of people you'd want with you in a bar fight, even when you caused it, 'cause you talk too much shit. Or when you got a flat tire somewhere out in Jones Creek, here they come a racing cruising in some stupid jacked up truck. Take me to the beach, shooting fireworks, feed me crawfish. Trick your cousin into buying beer. Lately I've been struggling, I've been failing, mostly drowning. I could use a friend to get me out of here. If we're gonna make a comeback, we're gonna need those people, like my friends on the bottom that don't know who to fight. Remember, you're a worker, less different than an owner, and you ain't got the dollars now to make this turn out right. No matter who you vote for, conservative or liberal, through piles of goddamn money, your voice don't make a sound. Our strength is in our numbers, in the streets is where we show them. You force someone to listen to you when they're fucking